In this video, we're going to be looking at the second of our learning approaches. We'll be looking at social learning theory. So just to remind you of the AQA specification, there are two learning approaches that you need to know. The first is the behaviourist approach, which we've looked at the research of Pavlov and Skinner and their theories of both classical and operant conditioning. And now we move on to look at our second learning theory, which is social learning theory. And specifically here, we're looking at the work of Bandura with his very famous Bobo doll experiment, and also his ideas of cognition involved in that stimulus response learning, first proposed by the behaviourists. So here is your learning checklist. Ensure that you can confidently tick off each of these items. Just to introduce the concept of social learning theory, I know you've watched an introductory video already, but I'd like you to read these quotes by Bandura. Pause the video at this point just to get a sense of his theory. So clearly what we have here is recognition that humans don't have to directly experience consequences for ourselves. We don't have to experience shocks, electric shocks in a Skinner box, or we don't have to specifically receive rewards like pellets of food for our behaviour like Skinner's rats. We can actually learn by observing other people and the consequences that they receive for their behaviour. And that gives us a little bit of a shortcut. And as humans, that means that we can learn really, really rapidly. And this can explain how social norms can spread. This can explain how fashions and trends can rapidly spread through a population. So Bandura recognised that we're not just unthinking organisms like pigeons and rats and dogs that were studied by the behaviourists. These animals reflexively respond to stimuli in their environment without thinking. But humans, we're unique. We have cognition. And that's important in learning. So here are the key assumptions then of the social learning theory. It's fine for us to refer to this as SLT. The first key assumption of social learning theory is that learning is fundamentally a social process, that we can learn via observation of other people in our environment. And we don't necessarily need to experience consequences, i.e. reinforcement or punishment, directly in order to learn. That brings us on to a related point here about vicarious learning. That word vicarious means sort of experienced through somebody else, for example. So vicarious learning is basically experience through the feelings or actions of another person. So vicarious learning is the fact that we don't have to learn by direct experience. In the case of behaviorism, we have stimulus response learning, and we have to be the ones to receive that response. We have to be the ones to receive, to salivate ourselves or to receive a pellet of food ourselves. In social learning theory, we recognise that learning doesn't have to be via direct experience. Actually, we can learn through observing the behaviour of models, and we observe the consequences, i.e. the reinforcement or the punishment that they receive for their behaviour. So we are learning via observation and imitation. Factors that influence the success of social learning are the characteristics of the model that we're observing. We're more likely to imitate the behaviour of a model who has desirable qualities, who is similar to us. And we call this process identification. If we identify with the model, then we're more likely to emulate and imitate their behaviour. And finally, a really important part of social learning theory is that cognition is involved in learning. This is not just simple stimulus response learning like the behaviourists argued. Mental processes are involved. So just to quickly compare behaviorism with social learning theory. The behaviourists were really interested in studying animals, and it was all just learning via association. In the case of classical conditioning, we're associating two stimuli, and in operant conditioning, we're associating a behaviour with the consequence that follows it. But in both of these cases, the organism itself, the dog here or the rat or pigeon, is experiencing that association directly. On the other hand, social learning theory is much more focused on humans because it relies on more advanced cognition that humans are capable of. And here, we don't have to learn directly ourselves. We can learn from models in our environment. We observe their behavior and we observe the consequences of their behavior, and we can learn for ourselves that way. So vicarious learning, this is learning that occurs by watching others, by watching models. So observing their behavior, but also observing the consequences that they receive for their behavior. So vicarious learning could involve vicarious reinforcement. And this is when the model is rewarded for their behavior. They receive reinforcement. And therefore, we indirectly also learn that that particular behavior will result in that rewarding consequence, that reinforcement. But also we have here vicarious punishment. And as that suggests, here we see a model perform a behavior, perform an action. And in this case, the model is punished for that behavior. We, in turn, recognize then that that behavior will result in an undesirable consequence. So we ourselves are less likely then to imitate that behavior. So it's both vicarious reinforcement, where we watch the model be rewarded for their behavior, so we are more likely to imitate that behavior ourselves. And vicarious punishment is when we observe the model being punished for a particular behavior, so we ourselves are less likely to imitate that same behavior. Now, the characteristics of the model will determine how likely it is that we're going to observe and imitate their behavior. Modeling is just the process whereby a child or an individual imitates the behavior of a person. In this case, the person that we are observing is known as the model. In order for us to identify with the model, observers must feel that he or she is similar enough to them that they would likely experience the same outcomes if they performed the behavior that they've observed. So we must feel similar enough to that person, or we must feel that they are desirable enough that we would want to emulate and imitate their behavior. So children and individuals are more likely to identify with models who are similar to them. So particularly we see a lot of same-sex modelling. So children looking up to same-sex models. And that can explain, for example, gender development. But they're also more likely to model behaviour from models who have desirable characteristics. So if a model is attractive in some way, if they have high status, if they're very, very good at that particular behaviour, if they have expertise or fame or wealth or beauty, whatever it might be, models that have desirable characteristics are more likely to be imitated. Something important to note is that the model doesn't actually have to be physically present in the environment. So models could be symbolic models. So somebody, for example, that's on TV or in a magazine can also act as a model. They don't have to be a live model, somebody physically present in the environment, like a parent or a teacher or a member of the peer group. Symbolic models can be just as effective. Now, mediational processes is maybe one of the most important aspects of social learning theory. If we just cast our minds back to behaviorism for a moment, behaviorism explained learning as just stimulus-response learning. For example, in Pavlov's experiment, the dog hears a bell and it salivates. And that's a fairly reflexive response. There's really no cognition, there's no thinking, there's no decision-making involved in initiating that response. But social learning theory differs from this because it places special importance on mediational processes. These are internal mental processes, i.e. cognition. And we can see here that these mediational processes, these cognitive factors, intervene in the learning process. They intervene between stimulus and response, hence why they are called mediational processes. They mediate in the learning process to determine whether a new response is actually imitated. So in that respect then, social learning theory is really acting as the bridge between behaviorism and the cognitive approach. It recognizes that, yes, humans are learning to respond to stimuli in their environment, but it also emphasizes the importance of mental processes in determining whether that behavior will actually be imitated. So Bandura, he claimed that in order for social learning to take place, the observer must form mental or cognitive representations of the behavior that they've observed of the model, and also the consequences that that model has received for their behavior. And we might store these mental representations for days, for weeks, for months, for years, decades, before the opportunity to imitate that behavior arises. Because unlike rats in a Skinner box, we're not just unconsciously responding to stimuli in our environment. Sometimes we're unable to or unmotivated to imitate the behavior for some time. So, for example, we might watch Wimbledon and we might watch how to perform a tennis backhand over and over again. But it's not going to be until sometime in the future where we actually have that tennis racket in our hand that we're going to have the opportunity to imitate the behavior we've observed. And that means that we must be forming mental representations that store that information between observing it, i.e. the stimulus, and being able to respond to it, being able to imitate it. So this really shows that cognition is involved in learning. We are not just unthinking, unfeeling organisms that immediately and reflexively respond to stimuli in our environment. Actually, sometimes we might need to store the representation of what we've observed for a really, really long period of time before we're able to then perform that behavior for ourselves. And just as a really simple example, we see this with parenting, for example. You observe your parents and how they go about parenting while you're young. And it's not going to be until decades later when you're a parent yourself that you then might start to imitate some of those techniques and those strategies that you learnt from your parents. And so we're having to store that information for decades. So clearly there is some sort of mental representation, there's some sort of cognition involved between stimulus and response, between observation of the model and imitation of their behavior. So this really brings us then on to focusing on these mediational processes in a little bit more detail. So in order to imitate somebody's behavior, there's got to be an intervening cognitive state. This is what we're referring to here. And this is these mediational processes. These are cognitive factors which mediate or intervene in the learning process to determine whether a new behavior or a response is imitated or not. So what happens between the stimulus, the observation of the model, and the response, the imitation of their behavior? Firstly, we have the learning itself. In order for behavior to be eventually imitated, the first step is really paying attention to that behavior. We have to notice the behavior in order for us to then eventually be able to imitate it. So we're looking at who performs the behavior. Is it eye-catching? Is it novel? Is it being performed by a celebrity or a model that we identify with? And so on. So the extent to which we notice certain behaviors is going to be an important first step in eventually imitating that behavior. But remember that we're not just unfeeling, unthinking rats in a cage. Sometimes it might be a really long time before we have the opportunity to actually display that behavior. So we must be able to form mental representations of it for a long period of time. And this is where retention comes in. This is essentially how well that memory, that observation, that behavior is remembered. We have to form a cognitive map, a cognitive model of the behavior that we've observed in order for us to later be able to imitate it. Then we kind of move on to, I guess, the performance aspect of it. So we've paid attention, we've noticed the behavior, and we've stored that behavior as a memory for a long period of time. But what will dictate whether we actually perform and imitate that behaviour? First of all, we've got to have the ability to actually perform that behaviour. We've got to be able to reproduce that behaviour. And this is going to depend on our physical capabilities, how easy that behaviour is to actually perform. It's going to depend on how our strength, our flexibility. Are we actually able to imitate that behaviour? Can we perform that behaviour ourselves? So I could watch basketball NBA players slam dunk all I like, but I will never, being the height that I am and the physique that I am, be able to slam dunk for myself. So this is where I might fall down, and this is why I will never be able to imitate the slam dunks that I observe, because I don't have the ability to perform it. I'm not able to reproduce that motor action. And then finally, even if we are capable of performing that action, we need to have the motivation to do so. The motivation is our will to imitate the behaviour. And this is really going to depend on that vicarious learning we've touched on earlier. Was the model reinforced? In which case, we might be more likely to have the will to imitate their behaviour because we believe that we too would receive those same rewards. Or was the model punished? If they were punished, then we believe that we too would be punished if we imitated their behaviour, so we're therefore less likely to imitate it. So these mediational factors, these are these cognitive or mental factors that mediate or intervene between stimulus and response. These are the cognitive factors that are occurring between stimulus-response learning, i.e. the observation and the imitation of the model. And these factors really determine whether that response or that behaviour is not just acquired, but is actually imitated. Because, for example, we might acquire it, but we might not necessarily imitate. So at this point, I'd like you to watch the video on Bandura's very, very famous Bobo doll research. Where here in the video, it takes you through the procedure and also the key findings of this research. And we can use this research potentially as AO1, but I think it is more suited to AO3. And when you come back from watching that video, then I'd like you to, once again, read through this slide and just make sure you're really, really confident with the procedure and these key findings. Key findings include the fact that children who observed the aggressive model were themselves more aggressive, which is quite an alarming finding. This research shows evidence of identification because children who saw a same-sex model, i.e. boys who observed a male model and girls who observed a female model, were more likely to imitate their behaviour. In a follow-up study to Bandura's research, we see evidence of vicarious reinforcement and punishment, i.e. models that were rewarded for being aggressive. Children who observed them were more likely to themselves show aggressive behaviour, and children who observed models being punished for their aggressive behaviour were less likely to imitate that aggressive model's behaviour. So a really key study here. So a little thinking exercise for you now, one that we'll discuss together in class. Based on your knowledge of social learning theory, why might parents be worried about their children playing violent video games? And 3 more activities for you to complete, which we'll review together in class. I'd like you to, again, like we did for classical versus operant conditioning, identify the perhaps similarities or differences between behaviourism and social learning theory. Some of these require you to really think deeply about the differences between the two. I'd like you then to complete the key definition table and to complete the 6-mark AO1 gap fill so that we've got a nice model answer ready to go there.